Just a few final word. The origins of setting up the Institute for Dublin City University were primarily from some of us who either had personal connections or some professional connections with India, but a real sense that despite South Asia's scale and India's scale in particular, but the broader region, uh, it was not well taught in Europe, and in very many universities not taught at all. And I was involved in a survey which the EU um, supported more than, I think, probably 15 years ago now, where we looked at the syllabus across leading universities right across, particularly the West and Central European uh, parts of the continent. Uh, and South Asia was not only the most significant world region that was least taught in leading universities in Western Europe, it was the only world region that was not taught at all in many of them. And compared to East Asia, Northeast Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, uh, even by comparison to other parts of the global South or the emerging world. So it wasn't simply a Western-centric, Northern Hemisphere-centric view. Even universities who taught other parts of the world did not introduce their students to South Asia in anything like the same way as they introduced them to, for example, Latin America or China. And so there was a sense there that this was something, particularly as South Asia would have had an emerging and greater global role, but also just for simply its own sake and an important part of Europe's relations with the broader world. That how could Europe do that effectively if consistently the next generation of its professionals it kept producing for government, civil society, and private sector were released into the society and workplace with almost no knowledge of South Asia at all. In some cases, literally no knowledge and no ability to choose courses as they studied politics, international relations, business, history, sociology, with that focus. And so we thought in our own way we would do this not only in our own university and hopefully in Ireland, but through the European Union's Horizon and Erasmus framework, also hopefully serve as a catalyst to work with some others across Europe who were also had the same aim and the same encouragement. I'm glad to say we've had some modest success in that, and certainly something we want to continue to do at a greater scale. And one of the things that was pleasurable in that was the launching 5 years ago now, because we missed 1 year last year, since our fourth annual conference, was to launch this conference in DCU. And in only its second year, it was one of the largest conferences in Europe on South Asia. And I would think, certainly from my experience, one of the ones that had the best blend of scholars uh, coming from South Asia and Europe, and also a really nice mix of early career scholars, PhD students, recent postdoctoral fellows. And so it was great to be able to have that presence on the campus and support that coming together, particularly of scholars just emerging into the discipline, having the opportunity in a relatively friendly, I think, and relaxed atmosphere to mingle and meet with experienced scholars who were given of their time. Um, and the other thing we wanted to do in that work was to have, uh, as Javante in her opening remarks, a scholarship that was rooted in the real world, that was rooted in a socially focused research program of the highest academic quality, but research with a purpose, with a social purpose in terms of the world. And so the interconnections, in particular between academia, civil society, and the humanitarian sector, were important to us. And therefore, it's hard to think in some ways of both a topic and indeed an honoured guest that could encapsulate that commitment we had from the very beginning for the broader institute and for this project itself in terms of the conference than our honoured guest this morning. Meghna Guhathakurta is, I think, one of the leading advocates in South Asia with a real global profile on dealing with socially marginalized communities in general, and in particular within that broader canvas focused on gender and sexual politics, gender and sexual violence in her own country, across the region, and globally. She has a PhD from the University of York in the UK. She now, having spent a career in the University of Dhaka teaching international relations, teaching and researching these subjects, has now worked in a research organization in Dhaka, which sort of, I suppose, perhaps gives her the institutional capacity to focus on those issues more directly from a socially organized capacity. Her own scholarship is both in quantity and quality, something you really need to get engaged with if you have not done so to date. Her own work through now the Research Initiatives Bangladesh in Dhaka, particularly bringing that research and that focus to marginalized community. She's been an advisor to the International Hill Tracks Commission, focused on that particular challenging issue. But today's talk, dealing in particular with the Rohingya camps and the host communities, and dealing with the really challenging issue of sexual and gender-based violence in the context of humanitarian emergencies, where the scale of who is vulnerable, the scale of who is marginalized is both greater purely and also perhaps both more visible and more invisible at the same time. And I think her work brings out that high profile of the issue, but within that broader international attention, many issues, and particular gender and sexual based violence, perhaps gets lost in the broader narrative. And so I think the abstract that she's provided for this morning's talk in looking at that issue in the humanitarian crisis and bringing us to think more deeply about it, to think how we as global citizens and as academics have duties and responsibilities to first of all learn, to inform ourselves, and to inform our own work with the sort of social dynamic that Meghna has brought to homework. So without further ado, I would say, as I said in my more informal remarks as we met on screen, it's a great pity we could not do you the honour of hosting you in Dublin. Perhaps when this crisis is all over, we may have some other opportunities if you're in a position to take the time to travel. But we are delighted nonetheless to host you in this format and have the participants of the conference the opportunity to hear your perspectives on this crucial and important issue. So I hand the floor to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor John Doyle, for this wonderfully generous introduction. I myself am very honored to be hosted by the Dublin City University. I've never been to Dublin, that's true, but always wanted to be there. It gives me great opportunity to be virtually present at such an occasion where the India-Ireland Institute of the Dublin City University very, very well-organized conference under difficult circumstances. So I'm really happy to getting to know you, and I'm sure this will only be the beginning of further. And I think I can't do the topic more justice than what Professor Doyle has just said about why I wanted to the background through which I am sort of addressing this topic that I'm about to launch today. Now, Rohingyas and crisis has become quite a subject of great international attention, and especially academic attention, as well as much more interventionist ones. But I think, and of course, sexual and gender-based violence is not sure about migration services or emergencies. So, but it's a much more longer perspective than one would really like to think of, usually in terms of emergency, because emergencies or humanitarian crisis situations are always perceived in a short-term manner. So the crisis comes, it's like almost a pandemic, that we didn't foresee the pandemic coming in our midst, but when it did, we think, oh, for how long will it last? 6 months, 1 year, and now another year maybe. But But the fact is the impact of what happens lasts a much more longer time and affects the fabrics of our society in a much more deeper way than we would like to think during the crisis. So we often, our policies are not always oriented into thinking of that long time perspective when in the middle of a crisis. But so therefore, I would, although I will be talking about sexual and gender-based violence in humanitarian crisis, drawing on my experiences of the Rohingyas in Bangladesh. I would also be wanting, and because I am in a workshop where it's a lot of postgraduate students are here, and a lot of them are doing PhDs or thinking of doing PhDs in the future. I would really like to sort of engage with them in this long-term perspective, because often a long-term perspective has first to be taken by an academician as opposed to an institutional actor like the UN or an emergency service provider. So this is where I would really think that this is the place in which I can talk about it and perhaps engage you into a conversation with it. So that's one thing. But the other thing is a little bit about my background with working with the Rohingyas is that, well, as executive director of Research Initiatives Bangladesh, we first went into that region as a partner of the UNHCR long before the current crisis occurred. And that was in 2011, when only about 30,000 refugees living in official camps, they were called registered refugees, were acknowledged by the government of Bangladesh. And the UNHCR, along with the government, was looking after them. So Research Initiative Bangladesh was asked by the UNHCR to do something rather unusual, and which is that instead of, and we're not an NGO, we're not providing service, but we do undertake action research, participatory action research, where we involve the people into our research, and we as co-researchers, and we try to seek some solutions out of problems along with them. So, and through that method, we had developed a model called the Kajuli Early Childhood Learning Method, where it was community-based. Now, we were asked to not rather asked, but we took upon ourselves to intervene in a refugee camp through the precepts of a community-based project, and to see how, and that itself constituted a research, an action research, because we had to go to the people and ask them to undertake early childhood learning in a condition where they were not even getting proper avenues to look after themselves in terms of health, in terms of food, etc. So that was a big challenge. But in doing that, we actually broke the barriers of research and action, and and that was the beginning of our journey there. So basically, what I'm going to talk today is based on some individual work that I've done from 2016 to 2020. And but the fact is that I will draw keenly upon the experience we have had from 2011 onwards as action researcher in that region, and also continuing it up till 2020. So this is basically the background. So a lot of my work methodologically is based, the one I'm going to present is based on sort of empirical research, which is quantitative as well as qualitative research, but a lot of the insights that are derived from that research is based on what I would say my field observations during this whole period of time, and basically participant observations, as well as kind of an ethnography, but not in a very rigid sense, but hoping to lead to some ethnographic studies in the future, perhaps. So on sexual and gender-based violence, and could we now share the slides, please? Thank you.
Yes, of course. Just 1 second.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next slide, please. Yeah, so we know that the study of sexual and gender-based violence in humanitarian crisis is quite well established by now, and there are data from all over the world and reports which point to the intrinsic linkage between the two. So data from 80 countries suggests that 1 in 3 women who have been in a relationship have experienced physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner at some point in their lives. It's a general study, but in emergency settings that women endure multiple and compounding forms of violence, as well as the fact that there is a study which says that 1 in 5 displaced women have experienced sexual violence. Now, this is the background through which we have, taken the task of looking at sexual and gender-based violence in the Rohingya crisis area. But the next slide. Before we go into that, we talk about what kind of a crisis it is. Now, most of the international attention has been focused on the current influx, which is about from August 2017, when about almost 1 million Rohingyas came into what was described as, from Myanmar, the Rakhine state of Myanmar, from what is described as one of the most rapid developing refugee situations in the world. It is perhaps not the largest refugee camps, but it is definitely the largest developing refugee situation, and has at one point in time taken over even the population of the refugees. Is currently in one particular district has superseded a local population. The area in which they come to is Cox's Bazar, which is a coastal district area, and it is also not the most richest area in the country, although it does one of the longest beaches and in drivable beaches in the world, as well as a big resort town. But the outlying areas are quite impoverished compared to other districts in Bangladesh. But the most important thing about the crisis, it is a protracted refugee situation. That means it did not develop in 2017. Myanmar and Bangladesh shares a border for hardly about 75 miles or so, unlike the border we have with India, which is more than 1,000 miles in distance. But basically, it is a crucial hotspot, because of the militarized situation that we see developing in the Rakhine state of the Myanmar. So in 1978, when we've had one influx of refugees, and was because of military operations taking place in the Rakhine state. Then we have had a stopgap, and then again in 1991 to 92, in the 80s, you know that a new citizenship law was introduced in Myanmar, where the Rohingyas weren't considered to be citizens of the country, nor were they given the group was not given status of being an ethnic group. So Rohingyas were called non-citizens, and many of them were refused to take up a card which gave them citizenship, but it started in 82 onwards. But by the time the refugee situation started, that means the migrants started coming as a result of statelessness in Myanmar, it was 1991 to 1992. So that was another influx that we faced. Then came, some of them went back, some of them, and these were in fits and starts. The government talked with each other. Some were sent back to Myanmar in the Rakhine state. But then in 2012, there were intercommunal tensions between the Rakhines and the Rohingyas, and that also created an influx. And I must say that until that time, the Bangladesh government did not have open borders. So they did not open the border. Instead, those who came in illicitly, under, and once inside the country, they could not be, sent back under the non-refoulement principle. Bangladesh government not having signed the Refugee Convention, but still was under certain, as a member of the United Nations, was still under certain compulsion to accept the refugees once they were in their territory. But they did not voluntarily open the borders until, in fact, 2017. So in 2016, there was the beginning of raids by the the rebel groups in the Rohingya, among the Rohingyas called ARSA, A-R-S-A, and they were, and as a result of that, I'm just cutting it, I'm just taking the whole in leaps and bounds, so that, because that's not our main focus here. So there was the ARSA clearing operation according to the Myanmar government, which actually we know now from from the United Nations that investigation team that is close to being a genocide, or at least crime against humanities with genocidal intent, was created in 2017. Next slide, please. The next slide, please. Yes. So before we go on to what is on the slide, so therefore we see that in our, as a protracted situation, so Bangladesh already had about an estimated 330,000 formal acknowledged refugees and 300,000 undocumented Rohingyas living in Bangladesh. Over this whole period of time, they had come to Bangladesh, they had intermingled with the society and had been living there in that area and around Bangladesh, in other parts of Bangladesh for a long time. And they were called, in fact, undocumented Myanmar citizens by the Bangladesh government. But before that, we must discuss the fact that why it is important to look at, before we come to look at sexual and gender-based violence, that a particular the UN agencies that were there were starting to roll out programs on gender-based violence, but they were able to reach only the 30,000 official refugees. The 300,000 in the Myanmar, in Bangladesh, who were undocumented, were not taken in cognizance until 2000, just before 2017, when a kind of census was done. And basically 300,000 was an estimated figure given by the Bangladesh government who undertook the census. But the census was really not released. And before it was made public, the next influx came in, which was which really overwhelmed the whole apparatus, the whole policy, and the whole country as such. In order to talk about some of the sexual and gender-based violence and the crimes that are committed under this banner, I must talk about where these data that I'm going to show you comes from. It is a study that is still being undertaken by the Center for the Responsibility to Protect of the University of Queensland, Australia, who has tried to develop an apps in which to create an early warning system for SGBV. And RIB, Research Initiatives Bangladesh, my institution, was asked to do a kind of field work and gather some data so that it can feed into that apps and help it to develop the apps. So this is not really, although it has been done with certain methodological rigor, but it is still not an end product, you could say. It will still depend, the data and the statistics is still being evolving, and hopefully by next year or by the end of this year, we will have an apps where you could see the data and can and it will be available to you online. But because we had to do the work, we did it basically in a very close situation in December 2020. Because of the pandemic, the lockdown did not allow us much mobility to go into Cox's Bazar and into the camps. So we got a window of 15 days. We have to take extra permissions and layers of permission, you can say, to go into the camps. But the host community was also done in a kind of a survey, and it was basically a quantitative survey with some qualitative findings as well. So this is the reason for this apps for an early warning system of SGBV was that usually in most of the early warning systems are on conflict areas, and an SGBV might find itself as a component, as one of the components of such an early warning system. But there is no early warning system except in practiced among a few NGOs. Most important of them is in East Timor, where only where only an early warning system kind of questionnaire is being, or survey is being made on SGBV. So this was an attempt like that. And in doing that, let me just share, you can see the type of crime. So our methodology was, the sample was about 500, 200 Rohingyas and 300 in the host community. And men and women, women were of 80% of the respondents and men were 20%. But interestingly enough, it was not administered on victims of violence, because it was the main aim was to create reportage of violence. So we asked respondents of any kind of crime, sexual and gender-based crime that they knew of in a great depth of, and then followed and then asked them about different things like which you will see about the frequency of violence and how it was dealt with or not dealt with, etc. So this is reporting on crimes of sexual and gender-based violence as reports from individuals and not necessarily from victims. The reason why we did not take victims, we thought that in a delicate situation like a refugee situation and also a situation which like the host community, victims will need to be protected. Although even the whole questionnaire was anonymous, but still we did not feel it was very pertinent to disturb victims on the violence. Although some of them may be victims of violence as well as the fact that they're reporting on it, we did not probe into them for ethical reasons. So basically, in terms of the crimes reported on sexual and gender-based violence, you can see that battering is the largest. The 30% is 30% of the people of Rohingyas And also the majority of the host community reported on battering or beating up. And then, of course, family violence came second. And you will see that deprivation from food and deprived of essentials came third. Among the Rohingyas, you will see that forced, basically rape was there. And you will see later on about the perpetrators of those violence. This was mostly in the state of Myanmar. So the reporting was not only what happened in the time that they were in the camps, but it was also reporting from what happened in Myanmar, because we thought that what happened in Myanmar, the crimes that they faced in Myanmar was so traumatic that it lived on in the camps and it lived on in their lives. So we left it open for them to choose what they would want to say as was notable crimes. So next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, when we asked them the number of times that the crimes were committed, automatically you see that the largest is, and in both communities, the most largest are 10 times or more. So how many times that the particular crime that they reported occurred? And was it 1 to 2 times? Was it 3 to 5 times, 6 to 10 times, or 10 times or more? So you can see from the last slide that wife battering, mostly you will see that it's wife battering. Battering in the family is basically has been occurring at a systemic and pervasive level, as opposed to some of the crimes that is 1 to 2 times have occurred mostly in Myanmar, and therefore have stopped, but because they were mostly committed by the Myanmar military or the Rakhines. Next slide, please. On the question of whether they thought that the crimes have been escalating, the answer was mostly yes. And it was more yes for Rohingyas rather than Bangladeshis, but both of them have more than 60% of both communities. More than 60% of both communities said that the crimes are escalating. Next slide, please. The frequency in which it occurred was it once, was it sometimes, or was it frequent? And you can see that it was mostly reported as sometimes, and in the host community, that is the Bangladeshi community, it was reported as frequent. Again, telling us how pervasive it was. The next slide, please. Were the perpetrator known or not? And you see overwhelmingly in both communities, the perpetrators were known. Next slide, please. And then we asked them, what was the relationship of the victim with the perpetrator? And you can see that spouse constitutes 58.7% among the Bangladeshis and 44% among Rohingyas, spouse. And then, of course, there was also neighbors or friend and family members. And that Bangladeshi, the host community had more than the Rohingyas. But there were also police and army, but there were 32.4% said the police and army, but there were mostly Rohingyas who faced sexual and gender-based violence from the police and army in the state of Myanmar. Next slide, please. Were the crimes reported? And here we see, if you look at this, the total, just forget the other man-women thing, yes or no. So no, majority, 75% or more of the Rohingyas said no, and Bangladesh is also more than 60% said no. So we say that crimes are not reported, but next slide, please. When we ask them why they were not reported, most of the answers from the Rohingyas said, believe that nothing would have happened even if reported. More than 50% said that. But among the host community, the answers were mostly stigmatization or the fear of repercussion. And it also, if you tie in with the type of crime that is mostly reported, which is, again, intimate partner violence, you will see that the real serious and critical nature in which such a crime exists in these emergency situations. The next slide. So this is as far as some of the points I would have liked, just some of the profile, you could say, of the sexual and gender-based violence that occurs in that region. And because it is 2020, it is, after all, our baseline data, and unfortunately, it is also a pandemic time. So we don't know whether there's such a high rise of, whether it is increasing violence within the pandemic because of the pandemic or not. We can only wait until 6 months after. If we have chance, we will have to do another survey and then test it. But since the pandemic is an ongoing situation, this time has still not yet come to understand the comparative value of this data. Now, about a little bit about the sexual and gender-based violence in general, and the contextual, trying to contextualize it in the region. In the Cox's Bazar region, there is a tendency of lack of documentation of marriage. Now, interestingly, one important fact to note, even in an emergency situation, the Rohingyas and the Bangladeshis are a bit different from many other refugee situations, because the Rohingyas and the Bangladeshis of that area share the same religion, which is Islam. And they also have shared almost the same lingua franca, because the Rohingya spoken language is 70% of it is the colloquial dialect, which is very different from normal Bengali of the Chittagong region of Cox's Bazar especially. And so very interestingly, when they come, there is no way of knowing the difference between a refugee and a local host community in terms of ethnic features or in terms of race, but in terms of religion or language. So this is an interesting feature. And because the situation has been protracted for a long time, we see that there are marriages have taken place and divorces have taken place through extra-legal practices. That means that usually in the Bangladesh legal framework, there is hardly any civil marriage law. There is some, but hardly anyone uses it. Most people use the religious laws or the customary practices, religious practices in marriage and divorce. That means that religious rituals are most of the religious rituals are the prime essence of a marriage ceremony. And although in the Islamic law, it says that they should be registered at the Qazi office, we have seen over the years that even the local population does not register them. They are very lackadaisical. They say if the imam, the Islamic priest comes into the house and performs the rituals, it's good enough because they are witnesses. And the woman usually, they are witness to a consent between the two people. So this is how the concept of non-stamp marriages have arisen in that particular area, and which is not really seen in other districts of Bangladesh. And that could be because of the Rohingya women because Rohingya people lacked documentation, they tried to enter into marriages to have some kind of documentation. And to access services. Like they thought that if they had a Bengali husband, if the Rohingya woman had a Bengali husband, at least the child will have a birth certificate, etc. So this is what happened over the years. It's not only in 2017, but over the years. So you have a situation like that, which exacerbates the informalness of a marriage, of entering into marriage, of conjugality, and of the rights, marital rights of the people involved. And of course, I've said that they have been reported in one of our earlier studies. We have seen that only 4.5% of intermarriages have taken place, but there may be more because we were looking at mostly Rohingya population. But if you went into the villages, you will see that maybe there have been more. But the intermarriage between a Rohingya and a Bangladeshi has been restricted in 2013. There's also officially in an Islamic marriage, polygamy is allowed, but we have reformed in the 60s, the personal code of polygamy has been reformed, saying that one can only enter it at the permission of the first wife. But we see the practice is not so much polygamy in the classical sense, but rather multiple marriages. So there are some men in that particular community, in the host community, who have been seen to marry and abandon their wives and then remarry again. So remarriage has taken, I've seen one case up to 17 times. So this is, and in the region, if you ask the host community, why is this so? They say that, oh, the more, there is a belief that that if a man has more wives, then he has a certain status in society. So whether that is believed by everyone in society, I don't know, but these are some of the practices in that particular region. There is, so although Bangladesh is quite well known for its activities, but in that particular region, there is a gap in the women's rights discourse, because a lot of the NGOs who work in that area are basically microcredit or microfinance or service giving NGOs like health and education, but not many women's rights NGOs have entered the field until now, when the 2017 influx came, and then now family and reproductive rights and also women's rights organization have entered the field, but that's very recent. And technology. Now, you know that Bangladesh is a country where the mobile phone is just, but it has brought blessings and curses, and is used both in communicating as well as in dating. Next slide, please. I will explain that later in the next slide. The next slide, please. We're almost finishing right now. So the other thing about this, the regional context is the age of betrothal. That is something we asked in the survey, and it was as low as 13 to 19. So early marriage has been pointed out as one of the underage marriage and early marriage. Both have been not so prevalent in terms of the types of crimes that are affected, but it is generally prevalent and increasing in society. But the fact is, instead of asking the age of marriage, we try to get to the root of the problem, which is betrothal. And if it is as 13 and 19, as low as all that, then the family pressure on getting a girl to get one, and then if they were not engaged so early on. Dowry, we do have an anti-dowry act. Now, dowry is not, again, not a formal system within the Islamic system, but there is in South Asia, we all know that marriage is a site for transactions, and sometimes it takes the form of very hard economic transactions. And although we do have an anti-dowry law, almost anywhere in Bangladesh, they have not been very effective, because it is economic transactions are taking place as part of gift, as part of demand, which is kind of a new system, economic transaction. Again, the further complicating the factor is that it's a trafficking zone that we are talking about, and family members, and that is where the communication system, the mobile phone, is especially important, because trafficking means not only goods trafficking, there's drug trafficking, there is trafficking of goods from Myanmar. The yaba is grown in Myanmar, but it is Bangladesh is a transit zone for its and many of the Rohingyas are carriers, as well as the local population are carriers, and in danger of being trafficked themselves. It also is a zone for human trafficking, which is also something manifestation of the emergency situation we see happening. And this is where it is a real endangerment of women and young children, especially. So post-traumatic stress is a reality, but something that somehow does not people take into cognizance. Men have been reported to say that they entered into a second marriage as a release, because they said that I got into difficulty with my wife. The wife was really suffering from PTSD, so she was not responding to him, and so he entered into a second marriage. And there are other cases where men have entered into a second marriage because having another wife along with the wife having two wives means the wife can be sent to different places for generating income. So for the family. So two wives make more income. So these are real factors and stories which have been told to us and by the people who have trusted us. Next slide, please. So at the end of it all, what are the lessons? Now, of course, I said at the beginning, such a complicated, complex factor that I don't think I have done justice to the situation of. So my appeal is to undergo more ethnographic studies in the region, to go for more longer time perspective, because you need to integrate all these norms and dynamics of a household that we see within a particular region facing an emergency situation, and of course how to sort of translate them properly and conceptually into a long-term perspective of a long-term solution, in fact. And maybe it goes beyond the humanitarian crisis situation. But there is also the short-term crisis situation, which we cannot ignore. And this is where some lessons can be derived from these studies for humanitarian actors. One is that the humanitarian actors usually have a good distribution of resources system, whether it is in terms of food or non-food items. They're very good at it, but they count heads. They don't necessarily go into gender-based household dynamics, where they know that there are 5 people in this family, so they've given enough food, enough materials for 5 people. But then what about the deprivation that we hear among the Rohingyas, that because one wife is neglected, she may be deprived of food resources, or are the women getting equal nutrition as the men in the family? These are questions that really that the humanitarian actor should be informed on. Social cohesion is often talked of by humanitarian actors that it's an important thing. But by social cohesion, they almost often mean what is mainstream. That is, if there is a majority and majoritarian kind of a social cohesion that is defined by the majority. That is, if there is a social cohesion in terms of the majority being Muslim, it seems that it is an Islamic sort of equation that we are talking about. But social cohesion is also about diversity. That particular area actually has more Buddhists than other districts in Bangladesh, apart from cities. I'm talking about rural areas. So because it is bordering on Myanmar, there are many Buddhists, many Rakhine Buddhists, both Bengali Buddhists as well as Rakhine Buddhists. And many Rakhine Buddhists are also working in the refugee camps as service providers. And these, so the fact that social cohesion has to be looked at from the point of view of gender, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and local customary practices should be a point that should be hammered on. And I think it can't be hammered on just by one or two instances, but a whole body of work needs to be done on this aspect. Prevention is as important as protection. Often humanitarian actors are more concerned with protection. Prevention is more longer term, and that is where early warning systems do come in. If the early warning systems have been developed by humanitarian actors, they would have sort of included it in their in the way that they offer protection to these people. And this is so therefore I must put an emphasis on prevention, which may be long-term, but also needs to be looked at from the point of view of a humanitarian actor intervention. And finally, we've seen in Cox's Bazar, after periods of lockdown, where only critical services were allowed. And what were those critical services? There were food, there was shelter, there were water and sanitation, and health, of course. There was no critical services, did not include SGBV or protection against SGBV. Only after the camps reopened were after having made it a point of various civil societies, making it a point to policymakers, they allowed protection to take, allowed SGBV as part of protection services. But it should be, especially in situations like the pandemic, where we see an increase of SGBV, there is no other sort of, there can be no other alternative but to take care of SGBV as a critical service. I end here. I thank you all for your attention. I'm very much open to questions, and I'd love to have a further conversation on this. Thank you.